Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining today. We've still got folks on their way in. I know that a lot of folks are probably coming in out of other meetings, but we will go ahead and get started. So, what are we doing here today? Well, today we are going to break down the acronym soup that we've all been swimming in, I think, for years at this point, right? We're going to take a long view and go through the evolution of detection and response, starting with its origins, which tended to be primarily more endpoint focused. We're going to go through kind of the transitional stage that we saw in the mid 2000s and early 2010s as we approach what the modern landscape looks like today and the convergence of some of these earlier technologies that we are going to be touching on. So let's put on our history glasses and we are going to take a dive back into the past. Now, the first virus itself, I think, was around 1971. I think the creeper virus was the first, like, actually out in the wild virus. But our first commercial antivirus solutions start to come to the scene in the late 80s. You can see we go from McAfee, Alwil, which would later become Avast, and Norton, just kind of one, two, three, start releasing antivirus software to address the growing threat of viruses. Now, at that time, it was a relatively limited threat. Largely, these were being spread through cracked software or SneakerNet, handled, passed off as a disk rather than delivered through the internet, as would become the most common trajectory point later. And these were monitoring software that would look for signatures that could be calculated a bunch of different ways to recognize known viruses and quarantine or delete them. Now, at this stage, antivirus was very much focused on handling discrete, named, known threats. And that means that they are looking for a pre-existing hash. Oh, happy holidays to you as well. We just got a happy holidays from Virginia. Please sound off in the comments. I'd love to hear where folks are listening in from. That's one of my favorite things. Uh, Traditional antivirus originally was just looking for known identified signatures, calculated. Hi, Georgia, how you doing? Calculated by, various different algorithms. These, can try and get better or worse at being fuzzy enough to capture very slight changes to try and evade that signature detection, like adding some empty bytes at the end, without getting so fuzzy that it's going to add a lot of false positives, right? South Carolina, we've got a very southeastern US crew today. I love that. As we move in to Beverly Hills and Michigan, I love folks that could bilocate like that. So as we move into the 90s, I don't know if folks have seen these early "so you got a computer" or "so you're getting on the internet" videos from the 90s. If you haven't, highly recommend it. A classic of the genre is the introduction to Windows XP with Matthew Perry, RIP, and Jennifer Aniston, I think. Yeah. Very much of its time. Highly recommended. Uh, Things pick up steam a lot in the 90s, right? We see the internet obviously had existed now at this point for decades in one form or another, but largely had been the purview of researchers, of college students. Now in the 90s, we're starting to see Prodigy, CompuServe, AOL, these commercial providers that are really making this something that is landing in more and more people's living rooms. We're also seeing some evolution in both the technology that our attackers are using, as well as the ways that defenders are trying to identify them. We're seeing the introduction of those kind of fuzzier hashes that try to find groups of files. The aim there is to try and find minimal changes to the source file. It got better at identifying that malware that had been really slightly spoofed, But as I mentioned, it reintroduces that risk of false positives and wasted time trying to triage alerts that may not actually represent a risk, which is something that we'll find is a bit of a theme as we look at these different technologies. We also see the shift that would only continue in the decades following as we move from uh, primarily that sneaker net type distribution to increasingly internet-based attacks. The little screenshot that you have up here of the email message is actually an example of the Melissa virus from 1999, really one of the first infections to make huge headlines and kind of seem to reinforce a little bit of the, I think, internet doomerism that was very common in the 90s for some reason. If you look at the media of that era, again, I'm just making recommendations for terrible media now, but I highly recommend if you deal with IT or security day to day and you haven't yet watched The Net with Sandra Bullock, please do. It's a great lens into historically how this technology was being viewed by the general public at the time some of it is coming out. We move into the 2000s and we see an increase in both the velocity and severity of these mass viral infections. I love you virus, my doom are a couple of really common ones. We see the growth of ransomware and spyware as malicious attack vectors, start to see the spread of some remote access Trojans, like BO 2000. You're going to have to Google what BO stands for. And then by 2006, spyware is starting to show up as a leading Windows threat in particular. And we see a shift in some of the defensive technologies. In addition to antivirus, now we're starting to see anti-malware, anti-spyware. And the big change, I think, in this decade, setting aside the continuing growth of internet adoption and more potential victims to exploit, I think this is also one of the pivot points where we see the the attackers market evolve and become more consumer friendly to attackers. Early attacks, you needed to be pretty technically proficient. It was very much a kind of build your own approach. We see moving into the latter part of the 90s and especially through the 2000s that a lot of these tools are starting to get commoditized, that are getting kind of nicely packaged up. And although the term skitty or script kiddie had been around, I think, since the late 80s, early 90s, slightly fuzzy on the origin there, but I remember starting to hear it sometime around then. Uh, we see, the skill level necessary to launch these attacks go down. And as a result, the volume of them starts to climb up. The easier it gets to launch these attacks, the more folks are going to try and do it. Now our technology, our antivirus is having to, at the end of the 90s as well, but especially into the 2000s, we're not just looking for executables, we're looking for macro embedded Microsoft Word files or Excel files. Then we move into the 2010s and get to next-gen antivirus. Next-gen antivirus is what you're most likely going to see some version of, whether that is integrated in a EDR, we'll get to that acronym in a bit, or standalone. And these really staked their claim, I should say, on a signature-less detection, increasingly, depending on the vendor, on machine learning or AI-enabled detection, quarantining threats, getting better at recognizing some of those fileless attack types that may not be delivered in the form that will actually be maliciously exploited on the computer, but rather with instructions used to reach out and gather the pieces necessary to compile that malware directly on the system. So what are we looking at outside of the endpoint? Because it was, as you noticed, a very endpoint user-focused approach here. Well, it gets a lot more complicated because we're talking a much broader set of technologies, but largely we're looking at some tools that you may still see in some form or another today. We saw a lot of VPN use, looking to limit access to the internal network. Similarly, firewall use, again, federating access to the protected network. This is oftentimes where we see that very like crunchy on the outside, chewy on the inside kind of security model that largely relies on keeping attackers from getting past that line of defenses. Obviously, we've had logging and the ability to analyze and review those logs for almost as long as we've been doing computing as necessary for debugging, not just for security research. But we were largely relying on the built-in system logging protocols for generating those logs. And it was a pretty arduous task to sift through and analyze and actually find potential issues in there. Our next-gen antivirus solutions, we're also seeing more and more moving into anomaly or behavioral detection, building on the heuristic detection that we saw in earlier versions of antivirus. Oh, and also intrusion detection systems. So now, rather than looking at visibility on the endpoint, this is looking more for suspicious activity across the network. Could be happening in traffic between devices, intercepting traffic through a attacker in the middle type attack, or trying to identify as an attacker is trying to pivot from one exploited machine or system to another. Now we move into kind of the transitional stage. As we move into the latter part of the 2000s and into the 2010s, one of the big trends that you see is single point solutions started to take an additional step back. And that may not be the best description of that, but I think that I'll be able to explain better here. So we're seeing now the introduction in the very late 90s, early 2000s of more language around security information management and security event management, looking to simplify and centralize that log detection on the information management side, trying to aggregate those logs and collect them and vault them for long-term storage or for retrospective or auditing-based analysis. Then we have security event management, which is real-time monitoring and alerts that is going to give a internal security team the heads up that there may be a potential issue that they need to look into and triage. You may be more familiar with SIEM, SIEM rather than SIM or SEM, and there's a good reason for that. And that reason is, these functions are very closely related. If you are investigating an ongoing incident, unless you are catching the very first indications and indicators of that potential attack, odds are you're going to need to look at some historical activity. You may need to try and find out how long that attacker has had access for. These are two functions that are very closely related in the organization's security strategy to be able to detect across a environment, not just within a specific endpoint or even within a specific network. You're looking at these two things simultaneously. You need real-time monitoring, and you also need a historical log of previous activity. And so, by their powers combined, we see the introduction of SIEM around 2005, 2006. I think it was within a couple of years after that that we start to see it as a Gartner category. And so we see here that we are at its simplest level, SIEM solutions, traditional SIEM solutions, were, again, better log aggregation and real-time monitoring. We'll talk a little bit in the next section more about the traditional benefits and challenges of SIEM. But when they're first introduced, we're looking at a relatively simple combination of that real-time event alert and long-term storage. As SIM technology improved and the landscape developed, we start to see better and better integration of the ability to add detections, searching for patterns that may represent activity, malicious or risky activity, and simplifying those alerts. One of the biggest challenges with not just SIM, but really any logging or alert tool that you have is trying to filter it down to just getting the relevant signal and reducing as much of the irrelevant noise as possible. SIEMs traditionally have been notoriously noisy, difficult to implement and difficult to manage, and take a good long while to really tune in so that they are reliably producing findings that are actually relevant. But who handles, right? We've seen a development in detection, information management, event management, putting those pieces together. On the endpoint, we've covered a little bit of response in quarantining of malware infections. But who's handling the response part of this broader full spectrum visibility that we have? Well, traditionally, that's going to be a SOC, security operations team operating internally. And that is the sort of eyes on glass team that, in addition to monitoring alerts and triaging tickets, is also responsible for preventative security strategy, for investigating in the aftermath of a potential incident. And this is great if you are part of a large enterprise organization. But I'm guessing for most folks, oh, good question. Apologies. I hope that wasn't sitting up there too long. Will we be able to get a copy of your presentation? There is a handout slide at the end that I think will be getting included in the follow-up email to go out. But I will be happy if you want to share your email. I'm happy to send a copy of the deck. Please don't judge me for my slapdash slide notes. So I'm guessing most of us, our offices don't look like this. I think that folks imagine something closer to NASA's Mission Control when they hear Security Operations Center. Lots of pew-pew maps and screens going off and alerts flashing. Uh, in reality, oftentimes the security operations team in a smaller organization maybe the same IT person that is handling routine network administration, inventorying laptops, and everything else. I found this to be kind of illuminating. This is a survey that Workforce did where they were trying to find, and now this is general IT, not specific to security, but trying to look at the ratio of IT staff to the organization as a whole. And what we see here, it can be a little bit deceptive because at a glance, the smallest organizations, less than 500, in many cases across the various quartiles, have the best ratio, but that can be a little misleading because oftentimes those organizations, the people that are handling IT may also be handling other functions within the business, right? It can company can get to a frighteningly large size before getting a dedicated IT function if that isn't something that receives a lot of love and attention early on. As we move into kind of the larger side of mid-market and into enterprise, 1,000 employees all the way up to 10,000 or more, we see that ratio improves as these teams get more, not only these teams get more developed and expanded and added to, but also bigger budgets, bigger companies means that we're able to invest in more technology that act as force multipliers for those teams. So we are able to, I hate this term because usually it means that we're getting budget cut, do more with less, right? That mid-market range though, that like 500 to 1,000 growth range is one of the most challenged in terms of the ratio of IT staff to the organization at large. And this is really where we see a common scenario of IT person who is sort of thrust into also handling security, may have a passing familiarity with security strategy and best practices, may not have a background in that at all and is kind of having to learn on the job. And so this is what we are seeing as we move into sort of the modern era of detection and response, where we're trying to answer that question of not really necessarily in mid-sized organizations, especially having a developed in-house expert team to respond to these issues. And as we move now into the modern era, I want to, rather than looking at the discrete technologies that we are talking about, taking one step back from that acronym soup and looking at it based on function, looking at detection and response as functions within the business. Because even more so, as we move into the late 20 teens and the current decade, what we see is further consolidation, even more so than trying to aggregate across similar services on different systems or different parts of the network. We're really seeing a movement away from single point solutions at all, right? So we're seeing rather than uh, identity management or password policy, we're seeing a more holistic approach to identity access management. We're seeing a move away from that very traditional signature focused or heuristic focused AV, and then adding on tools like anti-malware, anti-spyware, to these newer endpoint detection and response solutions that are really aiming to cover that ground and own the security of those endpoints. So now we are looking at kind of a few basic trees. We've got security, information, and event management. This is typically an in-house tool. It's focused on collecting and analyzing data across the environment. The challenges oftentimes, as I mentioned, is that it can be very resource intensive. It can require a good amount of in-house expertise. And depending on the solution, it can require a significant lift to both get integrated and then to get tuned to where it is producing consistently reliable results. Endpoint detection and response, again, focusing on the detection piece of it for right now. So this is endpoint specific. It's doing logging, it's doing threat detection and mitigation. Largely now we're in an era where we're seeing that rather than regular updates to download and inform of new threats, we're looking at continuous updates, cloud delivered solutions. This is the next step sort of in that AV, NGAV evolution, protecting devices against malware and other threats. The challenge there is, I think, kind of right in the name, that the visibility is limited to the endpoint. This can be a great element in a security strategy, but there's a lot to keep an eye on outside of the endpoints. Now, endpoints are a very common vector of attack. I do want to emphasize that. If we look at any of the incident response breach stats year over year in the Verizon report, what we're going to see is consistently exploited devices, whether those are endpoints or mobile devices, are going to be one of the leading common trends in successful attacks. So having a way to maintain visibility and enforce controls and automate quarantining or removal of some of those potential threats, I think is an important element of strategy. And I think a lot of times, especially in smaller organizations, it can be the sort of start and end of what they think of with security, but we need that full spectrum visibility. Managed detection and response. This can kind of straddle the line of either of the first two categories. It's mainly distinguished rather than being something that is handled in-house, it is handled through a contracted vendor. So this is getting your log management and analysis that is being typically set up and managed, tickets triaged by a contracted vendor. And this can seem like a attractive solution, especially if you don't have huge budget to hire new team members, if you do have a small in-house team. I am going to ask this question now, but I'm going to do it as a teaser. Can Blumira MDR slash SIM slash EDR work with multiple vendors in an environment? Yes, it can. I will talk a little bit more about that in the last section when we start talking about how Blumira fits into all of these categories and straddles some of them. But yes, the short answer is uh, these technologies are not necessarily mutually exclusive. We have customers who have or have implemented an EDR solution that are using that as one of the ingestion sources into Blumira and maybe augmenting the response capabilities of that standalone EDR through Blumira Agent and the endpoint protection portion of our service. But again, I'll cover a little bit more of that as we get further in. Um, the trade-off here is you do have to give up a fair amount of certainly control and day-to-day visibility. A common complaint that we hear from folks that are making a move from MDR to Blumira is that they weren't getting the kind of visibility into their own environment that they feel like they should have. It's also a lot harder to make routine use of some of those logs for non-security specific purposes. Log aggregation is fantastically useful, not just for security investigations and incident response, but it can be helpful for inventory. It can be helpful for auditing purposes. And so when you are outsourcing all of that to a managed provider, you're adding additional latency whenever one of those kind of routine requests has to be triaged. So flip the coin. We're looking at response now. We're going to talk about the Security Operations Center. Again, typically that's the in-house team, although it can be provided as a managed option. That is both proactive and response-based to mitigate security events. So proactive in that oftentimes they are doing the implementation and monitoring of the defensive technologies in the environment. Also reactive in that when a finding is detected, when an alert comes up, they are the sort of boots on ground folks that are responding and triaging that incident. Security operations centers are great if you're an organization large enough to have one. I think that the main trade-off oftentimes is having an organization and a security budget large enough to field that team the way that we might like. Endpoint detection response, looking at the response portion of it, is now using that cloud delivered intelligence to quarantine and mitigate threats. We are looking at modern, better fuzzy analysis here. So we're not just looking at signatures or even heuristic behaviors that may match the typical activity of a malware attack, but we're also looking at historical behavior by the system that is where this protection is running. We're looking at file lists, warnings when we see a potential new malware threat. So you're getting a deeper level of quarantining response, oftentimes by a low-level agent operating on that machine that's going to be able to enforce controls at a admin or a super user level, even if the user of that device is not able to perform those actions themselves. MDR, again, contracted services, oftentimes is going to be packaged with some kind of monitoring. They handle the alert triage. As I mentioned, there's some additional latency in notice and response. It's still often, the main selling point of these managed services is you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to have the folks internally. Your team can focus on their other duties, and the vendor can handle your security monitoring and response. In reality, without the context of the internal organization, oftentimes, even with a good MDR provider, there is still going to be some IT involvement in-house in triaging some of those tickets. A good example is if you have a security operations center and you get an impossible travel alert for Ruth's computer that usually is logging in from the Eastern Seaboard and all of a sudden she's in London. that may represent a potential issue. That may raise an alert that could result in the MDR provider reaching out to that IT team to see if there's a reason for this impossible travel. Or not even impossible travel, I should say a change in user behavior, typically on the Eastern Seaboard, now suddenly in London. If your SOC team is in-house, they may have seen in the company newsletter that Ruth is going to the, Global Finance Association administrators meeting in London, and so it's expected that she's going to be in London for the next week. So without that context of the day-to-day internal operation of the business, even with a good solution, that promise of you don't have to worry about it oftentimes doesn't materialize as much as we might like. So lining these up sort of side by side, looking at the benefits of SIEM, you're getting advanced visibility, hopefully getting full spectrum visibility. You're getting correlations and the ability to build detections. You're getting data normalization. Pardon me. So these logs that may not have the exact same metrics or telemetry that they're capturing are going to be able to normalize so that you can run queries against it. You can look at visualizations of that data over time and still get relevant results. You're getting some element of threat detection. The degree of that is provided as threat intelligence versus having to be built by the team itself is going to depend on the SIEM that you're looking at. And increasingly, the same way that we saw a big step up in authentication requirements a decade or so ago, we're seeing a shift in compliance requirements, both industry compliance requirements, government compliance requirements, and cybersecurity insurance providers' requirements are increasingly demanding that you have some solution for continuous monitoring, log auditing, log management. The trade-offs on those traditional SIEMs, very time intensive. It can quickly get very costly and difficult to scale, especially if you're looking at a more traditional appliance-based deployment. Oftentimes, inefficient alert management, certainly until you're able to get it well tuned, can result in delayed threat response. There's less so now, but traditionally, certainly a infrastructure footprint, and again, that cost that doesn't scale very well. When we look at MDR, getting better at proactive threat detection, you get that access to the security expertise. You're getting broader coverage oftentimes. These often are going to scale a bit better than completely in-house SIEM and SOC because they will more often work on a seat-based model. The challenge is, again, depending on the vendor, you may have limited logging. Some of the solutions that are out there are going to be very open and integrate with a wide variety of stacks. Others are going to be more of a closed loop and integrate with other services by that vendor or their partners and affiliates. You still can be looking at a delayed response. There's still the cycle of that ticket triage in place. The other trade-off is you may have chosen an MDR because you lack that in-house security expertise, but your MDR may also be using more junior staffers, especially on the SMB side of the market, and they may be juggling multiple clients as well. So I think that the devil that you know can be better than the devil that you don't. If the need is to scale up on the ability to recognize and respond to threats, rather than outsourcing that, I will favor, and I'm going to make the case for, options that will help you to do that in-house and extend your capability to do that in-house. I do want to mention here on these managed solutions, the other thing to keep in mind is that ultimately, at the end of the day, it is going to end up being the internal team's responsibility. If something goes wrong, we can certainly say, but that wasn't us, that was the MDR vendor. But oftentimes that's not going to be terribly persuasive for leadership. So if it's something that ultimately we're going to have to answer for, we want to find out if that's something that we are going to be able to handle. We're looking at the benefits of EDR. Certainly, when we're comparing that to the more legacy technologies, we're getting more advanced in our ability to detect fileless and signatureless attacks, getting more advanced in the ability to enforce automatic mitigation measures, not only quarantining or blocking traffic, but blocking execution of specific commands if they raise alerts. Again, EDR, some version of endpoint protection increasingly is showing up in compliance or insurance requirements. EDR, you're benefiting typically from very rapid updates or even cloud-based continuous updates. And you're getting that deep endpoint visibility, not just from a program that is running in the user's environment, but from that low-level agent that is getting better system access for logging and mitigation. The trade-offs, again, the visibility is only based on the endpoint. The trade-off of those low-level agents is that they can impact system performance. Typically, this is in the context of slowdowns. We had certainly one example over the last year that it can be more catastrophically impactful to system performance. And then the full utility of these services still requires staff support, whether that is in-house or managed. If all we're using is the automatic mitigation tools that are in that EDR software, we're effectively paying more than we need to for next-gen antivirus, right? Next-gen tends to be more preventative, trying to stop threats before they're able to establish a foothold. A lot of the additional benefits of EDR come in the additional remediation access, remote administration access, and additional response tools that are available to the folks that are responding when alerted to that threat. Now, if you've got a bingo card and you've been checking off everything that we've talked about so far today, you may have noticed that I didn't have a little blue box for SOAR or for XDR. SOAR stands for actually, we'll skip through here, although I do want to give everybody a moment to appreciate. I'm subtly trying to make the case here that the difference with XDR is that it was introduced by Xander Cage in 2003 as portrayed by Vin Diesel in the cinematic classic XXX. But no, that's just my little bit. SOAR, or security operation automation, security orchestration, automation, and response, that was my typo there, is a tool to extend the capabilities of a SOC team. Typically, that is going to be trying to automate mitigation or workflows that are relatively predictable and routine to help the team be freed up to focus on those more nuanced or unique potential attacks. This is the slide, by the way, that after I fix my typo, will be shared with you afterwards. Okay, so how does Blumira spell it out? Where do we fit in this whole soup? I think, I like to think of us as sort of a Goldilocks approach solution, where our goal is we aim to be a solution that will work for every organization. Our goal is if you are in a business where your IT team either suddenly or for some time has been responsible for security strategy, and isn't sure how to handle that, our goal is to be a level up for your team to help boost your capabilities. So the goals here, we want to make it easy. We want to reduce time to detection and time to response. We want to make sure that you're able to get that full spectrum visibility and still meet those compliance requirements. So we have both a SIEM specific edition as well as a more automated response or XDR-like solution. So when we talk about XDR, I would love to give you a discrete blue box that breaks down exactly what the features and functionality are of XDR. But this is one of the challenges that we get to as we move into this more platform-focused era of security, where we aren't always looking at the same pieces or the same single-point solutions getting pulled into that combined approach. So some XDR solutions are more focused on endpoint. Some XDR solutions are more focused on extending the automated response ability that a managed team is going to help support. In many cases, if we remember our little bears touching hands and turning into a panda, if you take SIEM on one side and SOAR on the other and mash those together, that I think is probably the most common understanding of what XDR is. So the way that we're doing this is rather than a totally in-house or a totally managed or outsourced approach to detection and response, we take a more guided detection and response or assisted detection and response approach. So the base level of that is visibility. If you want to be able to act on potential risks, you need to know about those risks first. To know about them, you need to have visibility into the environment. So we have comprehensive coverage, whether we're talking about inside your local network, on a specific endpoint, Mac, Windows, Linux, or cloud-based services. We have simple integrations of virtual sensors for the network, Blue Mirror agent for endpoints, and then cloud connectors integrations for cloud-based services so that you're going to be able to gather that intelligence across your entire environment, both your perimeterized environment as well as your SaaS or hosted or cloud environment. In addition to that, we are trying to address that challenge, not just the challenge in terms of setup, but the challenge in tuning in that we give you pre-tuned detection. So we have a detection engineering team that is constantly working to model threats, to identify the telemetry and patterns that may represent a potential risk, then not just pushing that detection out to the service, but then testing it, trying to reduce the potential for false positives. And then even after deployment out to customers, continuing to take feedback. If we find that there's something that we missed and there is a higher than normal amount of false positives being alerted, we're going to further tune that and then push that out so that it doesn't fall on the individual teams to handle that. Next question, next one up, we've got Blue Mirror agent. So again, endpoints, very common target. We want to make sure that we have visibility and can enforce controls there. With Blue Mirror agent, you're able to collect those logs, get that system activity, port it into your Blue Mirror account, but also you're getting the ability for some SOAR or automated response, where you are getting automated quarantining or automatic host isolation of affected devices, blocking activity to malicious IPs. So really aiming to simplify for clear and present threats, simplify mitigating that risk and limiting its ability to expand. Rather than being the team that you outsource things to, pause here real quick. I just see we've got another question, one for the end and one for right now. Would you consider Blue Mirror XDR a SaaS solution? Well, I think that we are a security as a service type solution. We have a subscription-based model. We have a largely cloud-hosted, cloud forward or cloud first approach to building our platform. So I think that probably I would say that we would qualify as SaaS. Hopefully I won't get in trouble for that later. Rather than trying to replace your in-house team or stand in as a fully managed team, we want to be an extension of your team. We look to make heroes out of that internal IT person. So as I mentioned, we have a detection engineering team constantly working to identify and build out new detections and tune them so that when you go and drop in that new integration and get a list of recommended detections to turn on, they are already ready to go. And day one, you can rely on the information, the alerts that you're getting are much more likely to be relevant and actionable. We provide you with play-by-plays. So when you get a finding in Blue Mirror, it is going to give you a little questionnaire alongside it that walks you through how to identify if this is routine activity or may represent a more serious threat. It will help you to clear out whether this is routine, whether this is an expected abnormality, and even to add notes if this turns out to be something that you need to investigate further on. That said, sometimes that potential threat is a real threat, is a priority one risk. In those situations where you need immediate intervention, we do have a security operations team with 24/7 accessibility that you can reach out to that will help you intervene in those sort of clear and present ongoing threat situations, so that you are able to get that additional expert support when you need it. On top of that, we have solution architects that are not just going to make sure that your pilot works, but are actually going to go through a really structured process with you after you get Blumira purchased to make sure that you've got a roadmap for what you need to have protected right now, what you need to continue to plan to integrate or that's coming up in next year's budget, perhaps, as well as giving you those routine and regular check-ins to make sure that things are still going well. Typical day in the life for somebody that is using Blumira, we've got your 24/7 monitoring. You get an alert, fast notification. You can trust that that notification is something relevant to act on, giving you that guided playbook response. And if it's something that moves beyond the level of that guided playbook, giving you access to that expert team. How it works? Like any other SIEM, we're going to start with log collection through those kind of three channels that I mentioned: Cloud Connector, Virtual Sensor, and Blumira Agent. We're going to transform that data, normalize, aggregate it, normalize it, parse it, start to deploy those rules and detections, analyze those logs as they come in for any matchings that could represent a finding, and then give you the ability to block those threats automatically through host isolation or malicious IP blocking, give you guided playbooks in how to respond, and give you that SecOps support where you need it. So I'm going to flip over now to our Q&A, and I would love if folks have other questions, please add them in the Q&A box now. Our first one here, question for the end. Blumira XDR, we're a CMMC, a government compliance standard, that a federal compliance standard that applies to any contractors that are doing work with Department of Defense, not just federal agencies. We're a supplier with ITAR and ER data environment. Do you offer US person only SecOps options? I believe the answer to that is yes. I will validate that to make absolutely sure, but I believe that our entire team is US based. So we can clarify and confirm that for you. Does XDR replace the need for EDR? This may have been one that was submitted after we touched on it a little bit earlier. The simple answer is it depends. Depending on what you're looking for. If you're looking for, basic endpoint visibility, quarantine ability, response, meeting your compliance standards, it can be a replacement for EDR. If you have a specific EDR vendor that you're using that you especially like the threat intelligence that they provide, you like the additional automated response measures like blocking those suspicious commands and not just quarantining or blocking traffic. It doesn't have to be an either or. You can keep that EDR and integrate it into Blumira so that you're able to not only get better detections and findings within Blumira with the additional visibility from that EDR, but now you're able to correlate it full spectrum with everything else that's happening across your environment. For folks that, as people go to add their other questions in, I just want to share, if you're curious, we do have a free forever SIEM edition. We also have a free 30-day trial of our XDR version. If you have additional questions on getting Blumira evaluated in your own environment or whether we're a good fit, You're welcome to reach out to us as well. You can reach out to me directly, zlindsay@bluemira.com. Another thing that I didn't talk about a whole lot in today's presentation, because it's not kind of a traditional part of that detection and response landscape, but we released a new free tool to do a security assessment on any domains that you own. So this is going to do a rundown of publicly discoverable services, as well as look at things like your WHOIS settings, to tell you about best practices that you have in place and ones that maybe you could still look to implement. This does not require having a Blue Mira account set up. You don't have to be a Blue Mira customer to use it. This is a service that we provide to give you a good snapshot of the security of your domain. Keep in mind, it's a snapshot. Blue Mira's service is going to give you that continuous visibility. Domain assessment is going to be a moment in time look at the security of that domain. So I'd encourage you to check out both of those. I'm not seeing any other questions come in. So with that, I just want to thank you all for joining today. I know that especially heading into the holidays, time is at a premium. I appreciate you spending a little time with us today. I hope that this was useful and valuable information for you. If you have other questions, if there's other topics that you'd like to see in future webinars, there's going to be a post-webinar survey that pops up here. I would love it if you can share your feedback there. We really do look at that feedback when we are planning our upcoming content as well. With that, thank you for joining. Until next time, stay safe, everybody, and have a great day. Bye-bye.